Well, hey everybody.
Hi. Hi, Lance.
Welcome to our last New York Society for General Semantics program of 2019. Yay.
It's been a wonderful year.
It has been a good year,
Yeah.
but we're looking forward to another good year to come. And I want to thank you all for braving the snow squall,
Yeah.
which is two words that I've not heard combined together before today. But apparently we're going to need many new terms for the weather in the years to come. And it's also a historic night here in the USA, and a good time to remember that general semantics as a movement has historically been firmly against bullshit. And has been really one of the great defenders of truth and of understanding the way that language works and understanding how best to evaluate the messages that we're getting and the reality that we're living in.
And peace and nonviolence.
I'm sorry?
And peace and nonviolence.
And peace and nonviolence. Amen, Terry. Amen. And so we encourage you all to, first of all, keep coming, to learn more about general semantics. And there are resources on the New York Society website and many more resources, some for free, some not, on the Institute of General Semantics site, but we encourage you to check that out. And as I always say, we bring this to you free of charge. We don't have a membership fee or an event fee, but we do encourage folks to become members of the Institute of General Semantics, for which, among other things, you get subscription to, etc., the General Semantics Journal, and I was very pleased to get my copy in the mail, the latest issue the other day. So if you join now, if you're not a member already, if you are a member already, if you haven't gotten it, it's on its way. And if you join now, you'll certainly get that issue and many more to come. Anyway, for tonight, we have, we always do something different, and I think that's, part of the fun of the New York Society. Tonight's program is very special for me, and the name of it is Mediating the Sexes, Women, Technology, and Work in American Narrative, which is slightly different but adapted from the title that Callie Gallo gave to her doctoral dissertation. But let me start in reiterating the event description that general semantics is concerned with how people communicate, how language and symbolic communication bestow upon us the capacity for progress via time binding, and narrative as a symbolic form provides a structure for making sense of our world and enhancing our capacity for time binding. Literature, as Alfred Korzybski, as S.I. Hayakawa, and as so many other general semanticists have made clear, literature provides maps to a variety of human territories, from the interior landscape, to use a phrase that Marshall McLuhan gave us, to the interior landscape of the mind, to our social interactions and cultural arrangements, both present and past. And as Marshall McLuhan and other media ecology scholars have observed, literature often provides us with a means of understanding technological and social change. Media ecologists often point to the 19th century as the beginning of a revolution in communications that continues to this day. We're still riding that wave, and whose effects we still need to fully understand. So, in her recently completed doctoral dissertation, Dr. Callie J. examines how a boom in new media technologies between 1840 and 1900 spurred influential waves of writing about emerging professionals and workplaces in the United States. She argues that canonical and popular authors, from Edgar Allan Poe, whose bust is up there in case you didn't notice, to Fanny Byrne, envision modern professionalism along gendered lines in response to three key innovations: the penny press, the Daguerreotype, and the Telegraph. Each successive media environment incited debate about how middle-class women's identities should or should not change, including their domestic roles and their racial and class status. Her interdisciplinary project combined media ecology, material culture, gender studies, and new historicist approaches to analyze how new professional and social identities for women are cultivated or curtailed through stories about new technologies. Let me introduce here at the center, Callie J. Gallo, recently completed her PhD program in English at Fordham University, and I was privileged to be on her committee for that. And I say that quite honestly because, you know, the dream for us professors is to have students who are so good that we don't really have to do anything and they make us look good. She is an upper school English teacher at the Marymount School of New York. Her work has appeared in James Joyce Quarterly. She served as managing editor for Explorations in Media Ecology for the past 3 years, and that's with me, and frankly, I consider her to be more of a co-editor than anything else. On her dissertation, Mediating the Sexes, Women, Technology, and Work in American Narrative, 1840 to 1900, she said, combines media ecology, cultural studies, feminist literary studies, perspectives, and analyses of networks of discourse about women and professionalism, revolving around the introduction of new media in 19th century America. So we're going to start with Dr. Gallo talking about her research, and then turn to two commentators. I thought this is a little bit like if you're familiar with doctoral dissertation defense where you have orals, but we're not going to put you through that again. But a little bit like that, where we'll get comments and questions from our interlocutors. And on my far left, your right, Salvatore J. Falica was born in Brooklyn, New York. He earned his doctorate at New York University, studying with Neil Postman and Terry Moran, and he currently teaches courses there in propaganda, spectacle culture, in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication. He's currently working on a project entitled Norman Mailer and Celebrity Culture, and he was awarded the Excellence in Teaching Award from the Steinhardt School of Education at NYU. I'm very happy. Yes, let's hear it for Sarah. And now I'm really very happy to have arranged this. I'm not sure if she really is happy that I did this, because Elena Lamberti is on vacation here for just a few days in New York City, and I tricked her into doing this with promises of martinis. But we are indeed extremely fortunate to have Elena Lamberti here with us. She is a professor. Well, please hold your applause until I introduce myself. No, until. Elena, let me tell you about her. And then give you something more to applaud to. She's a professor of North American literature at the University of Bologna, Italy. And she comes here, she just recently, when you arrived Monday night from Bologna, here she is with us. She's a specialist in modernist literature, cultural memory, Literature and Media Ecology, and War Literature.
Wow.
She's the author of 8 books and numerous essays and book chapters on Anglo-American modernism and American-Canadian literature and culture. She pursues an interdisciplinary methodology of research where literature stands at the core of innovative investigations of complex ecosystems. Her book, entitled Marshall McLuhan's Mosaic, Probing the Literary Origins of Media Studies, received the Media Ecology Association's 2016 award for Outstanding Book in the field of media ecology, and she's also affiliated with the Mobile Media Lab of Concordia University in Montreal. Now you can applaud. So thank you, Elena, for joining us here tonight. And of course, I am your humble host, Lance Straight, here to introduce and to moderate. And with that, I'm very happy to turn things over to Dr. Hayakawa, who I'm very proud to have here tonight. And I can tell you, by the way, I was there for her actual dissertation defense, and it was just, everyone's just blown away at how wonderful it all was. So please welcome, I know you applauded her before, but you can do it one more time.
Thank you so much, Lance, and thank you to Sal and Elena for being here. I really appreciate you all being here tonight. I am very humbled by that introduction and by the company, so thank you. So I will not explain my entire dissertation to you all, thank God, right? You don't need to hear all of that. So nobody does. One of my advisors told me, your dissertation will not be read by more than 10 people except for the family members that you forced. So I don't want you to read that either. So I want to keep his philosophy true. So what I hope to do tonight is to share some pieces of it, because general semantics as well as media ecology is about making connections, right? How do we trace different networks of meaning and knowledge and language, and how do we create kind of more intricate networks of understanding? And so what I would like to do tonight is just to kind of explain some of the basic premises of how I was finding patterns in literature of the 19th century that emerged around new media forms, particularly the penny press, the Daguerreotype, and the Telegraph. And in case you're unfamiliar with some of these, especially the Daguerreotype, I have some visual aids to help us. But I just want to give you an idea of some of the pattern recognition that I have unearthed that helps us specifically think about gender in the 19th century as new technologies are emerging, and in the literature of the period, how people are kind of testing what it might mean to have an identity that's built more and more around work, and to have an identity that's gendered within that, right? What does it mean to be a working woman? What does it mean to be a working man, a professional? How are we professionalized or deprofessionalized? And also to think about how the form of the medium itself gives rise to certain kinds of ideas about what identity and being a professional can be. Now, I hope to explain what I mean by that with a little bit more detail for you. So I'm not going to get too in-depth about the context of professionalism and lots of the kind of minor works that I talk about, although I'm happy to answer questions about them if they come up, and if Elena and Sal have questions about them too. But I kind of want to get to the big hitters, a lot of the big writers you might know, and introduce some people you might not know, so that you can start to see some of the patterns that I picked up on. So I'm going to start with the penny press. So if you look at your handouts, so fun, so just a moment, you're going to see the front page of the New York Tribune from 1841. 1841 is the year that Edgar Allan Poe's first detective story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, comes out. This is what a typical daily newspaper coming out might look like. As you can see, it's very crowded and you cannot read it. But I don't want you to read it, of course, because that's not the point. So penny press is emerging and becoming a kind of a currency in the modern day in terms of its accessibility, people having access to news, and more people reading than ever before in the 1840s as more newspapers come into circulation and they become cheaper and are made faster, and they're also made for the public in general, not just people who have money. They're made to entertain people. They're made to get people's attention. And so the front pages of newspapers start to become what Marshall McLuhan would call a mosaic. So if you see the way that the columns are broken down, and even the way that content is broken up, there's different pieces to this mosaic. And so, for instance, in this cover, there were brief advertisements, an extended editorial on labor, there was an article on legislation in the Senate, there were 3 crime reports and incidents, which are really important for Poe, because he was picking up on these, and works of poetry. So the newspaper was a mosaic of content that was constantly shifting. And so the pattern that I had noticed in thinking about literary representations around the newspaper of that time are thinking about how identity also becomes a mosaic, and based on the idea of a mosaic, just like the mosaic of the newspaper page. And so when Edgar Allan Poe is writing his detective fiction, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's noted as one of the foundational stories of detective fiction that come out from Edgar Allan Poe between 1841 and 1844 are Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Mystery of Marie Roget, and The Purloined Letter. These closely follow stories in the penny press that he was actively reading and adapting as he created his character, Auguste Dupin, who is the detective figure in the series, so I'll call him Dupin. And so he becomes the first detective professional that we have kind of literary representation of in its truest form. And that detective uses the techniques of looking at information as a mosaic, that you need to cross-reference and check and use different forms of knowledge to make judgments and assessments. And that's how his professional detective becomes so successful. And so I have a little excerpt on your handout on the last page of Dupin's abilities and techniques of perception. So I'll read this aloud to you. This is from the Purloined Letter. No sooner had I glanced at this letter than I concluded that it to be one of which I was in search of. To be sure, it was in all appearance radically different from the one which the prefect had read as so minute a description. Here the address to the minister was diminutive and feminine. There was superscription to a certain royal personage, marked boldly and decided. The size alone formed a point of correspondence, but then the radicalness of these differences, which was excessive, the dirt, the soiled and torn condition of the paper, so inconsistent with the true methodical habits of deed, and so suggestive of a design to delude the beholder into an idea of worthlessness in the document. These things, together with the hyper-obtrusive situation of this document, full in view of every visitor, and thus exactly in accordance with the conclusions which I had previously arrived.
No.
So as he finds this stolen letter, he has to cross-reference and check lots of bits of information. So he has to look at the location, the condition of the paper, what he knows about the person who has stolen the piece of paper, what he knows about the detectives who have looked for the piece of paper and have yet to find it. He cross-references all of that information. And that intellectual skill is built on this idea of the data and all of the different forms of information that start circulating through the newspaper. And so this is typically just a male identity in the story. Actually, all of the women are victims in the stories, and he doesn't save anybody. He just decides that he gets to solve who did it and walk away and get some money in the end, usually. And so the professional sphere that's based on the kind of formal properties of the mosaic becomes a male professionalized space. And so in contrast to that, we have Margaret Fuller. So Margaret Fuller writes this book, Woman in the 19th Century. I don't know if anyone here has read it. It comes out in 1845. It started as an article in the journal The Dial, the Transcendentalist Journal, but then she turns it into a longer work, which we can't call a novel, we can't call an essay, we don't really know what it is. It's just a text. And I say that because if you've ever read Woman in the 19th Century, it has no clear genre, it has no clear organizational method, but what it does do is say that gender is fluid, that there is no truly masculine man and no truly feminine woman. And the way that that fluidity of gender gets worked out is because women get to work. And not only is it because they work, right, that we get to see that gender is fluid, but it's also because she creates a mosaic of ideas about women, which should empower them to work. If you read this text, and it is very difficult to sift through, it's very hard to find an excerpt, which I haven't really given to you because it's quite hard to establish, but if you'll believe me and entertain me, she combines a deep history of myth, historical figures, literary folks, philosophers, botanists, so many different aspects of culture that she brings examples from to prove how women have, throughout history and over time, been the sources of power, been the sources of inspiration, had equal relationships with men, or have been in higher positions than men. And so she interlaces a mosaic of different texts, cross-referencing different things in history, from Minerva to Angelina Grimke, to think about how women have defied traditional gender barriers. And it's the idea of the mosaic, right, that we need to see identity as a mosaic of representations that creates this idea that women can be anything, and that they can be free to write, and that that expression will then empower the larger idea that women are professionals and can be seen as professionals. So that's pattern number one. Pattern number two is the second picture on your handout, so second page. Well, there's two pictures for you to look at. One is quite an entertaining picture of women wearing daguerreotypes. They're hats, they're on dresses, they are, you can see that they're decorative in nature here. There's actually a daguerreotype like on someone's head. And this is from Goody's Lady Book in 1866. And so this image stirs up the idea that when the daguerreotype comes out and starts being circulated into public use, there's a lot of different ideas circulating about what it should be used for and what it might mean for women. Should this be something that occupies a social sphere or a professional sphere? And you can see that this picture imagines women using photography in a truly social sense, rather than in a professional sense. And so we have this kind of long narrative of, right, men behind the camera and women in front of the camera, right, and men operating and being professional and women being the objects and the object of the gaze. So I wanted to see if there was something that contested that. And were there other ideas? And how did it reflect the form of the daguerreotype? Now, if you've never seen one, this actually isn't a daguerreotype, which is below that picture, but this is actually an ambrotype, which was done on glass. But it gives you the idea that I'm after that you can see, which is that if you hold a daguerreotype, which is on a silver-coated plate, which is mirrored, that's how they were initially made. If you hold it right up to your face, you're going to see your own face. Okay? Because it's silver. And also, if you hold it at a different angle of light, you'll see that it contains a photographic positive and negative, which is why you couldn't reproduce them. So it was all at once. And the reflective surface created that interesting effect. You can see that this is divided into two. The one side would be the negative and the other side the positive. So if you tilted it a different way, you would see, alternatively, the negative or the positive. And so the form of the daguerreotype contains this negative and positive at once. And it's what made this form of media really unique. And so how did authors use that form to generate ideas about gender and work? So Nathaniel Hawthorne's The House of the Seven Gables in 1851. features a daguerreotypist named Holgrave. And Holgrave likes to take weird, creepy daguerreotypes, especially of dead people, and they function in the story as a kind of Gothic motif to help progress this narrative about breaking a family curse. But an important thing to recognize that a lot of people don't acknowledge about that novel is it's all about women working. Phoebe Pynchon and Hepzibah Pynchon are the two main female leads in that novel. They are the hardest working women you will find, well, at least Phoebe Pynchon is. Hepzibah Pynchon does not really like to work, but she does it because she has to. And Holgrave comes in as the daguerreotypist, and once he shows Phoebe Pynchon this daguerreotype of a dead ancestor, she then ends her work life. She ends working in a scent shop. She stops this progression of work, and she goes out of a professional space. Meanwhile, Holgrave, the daguerreotypist, gets really rich, and he moves into a big old house, and he's used this technical skill to put him in a very positive kind of plane. While Phoebe Pynchon is now afraid for her life, fearing that she's being led down a path towards death, and she is no longer working. So she occupies the negative space. And so an alternative to that, in terms of using the form of the daguerreotype, comes out in Fanny Fern's Ruth Hall. In Ruth Hall, this is about a woman who, Ruth Hall writes for popular newspapers, and it's mostly about this woman's navigation of the newspaper industry. However, there's this really great minor story about her landlord, Mrs. Skitty. Mrs. Skitty is really upset about her husband who's away all the time. And she hates that he goes away, he's a little philandering, he's not too trustful or trusting, and she needs to come up with a way to gain some power in her marriage. And so they run a kind of boarding house, and so she really runs the show, but of course she's the wife, so her husband is kind of ruling the roost, and he gets to decide what's what and when he goes away and when he comes back and who takes care of the kids. She decides to give him a daguerreotype as a gift as he goes away for a business trip. But what she doesn't tell him is that she's actually taken the daguerreotype out of the case, thinking that my husband's not going to think of me on this trip. He's not even going to look in this case. And so, when he comes back from his trip, she asks him, "Did you look at my photo?" And he says, "Well, of course, I looked at it all the time. I just couldn't be away from you." And that is the moment that she gains power in her marriage and becomes the proprietor of their boarding house. Because Mr. Skitty realizes he does not have the power in their marriage anymore when she holds the daguerreotype in her hands instead of him. And so she puts herself in the positive plane and flips him into the negative plane, putting into our focus how easily you can flip back and forth between this positive and negative, right? The structure of power can be flipped so easily, just like a daguerreotype. And so Mrs. Skitty's power over her husband, she actually has him start to do childcare. She's taking care of the children. He eventually runs away to California because he can't take it. But she ends up being a business owner. She runs the business as she chooses. She decides how she's going to run it differently. And so it's so different that Fanny Fern decides it's a little too scandalous to live there because she has taken so many liberties with her freedom and pushing the bounds of her marriage so far. So here we see how the form of the daguerreotype is also informing this idea of flipping the roles, flipping the power, and flipping who gets to work and when. The final pattern that I want to point out is with the Telegraph. Now, the Telegraph, some of its main components are anonymity, right? You can't tell who's sending a telegraph message because you can't see that person. The second is that it uses code. And when the telegraph was emerging, to have coded communication, right, you had to have specialized knowledge. And women were actually sought out for these positions because they were seen as great mediators. They were seen as mediums, that they could actually filter that information and do so without processing anything mentally, without interfering with the messages. they were also, kind of in a contradictory way, assumed to be better stewards to interact with customers. And so women were actively sought after for these occupations as we get into the 1870s and 80s. And there was a host of popular literature that actually popped up around that time called mediated love stories, which were about men and women exchanging messages over the wire, not really knowing who each other are, sometimes playing some romantic games with each other and sometimes some mean games with each other, and then they end up getting married. It was a really popular genre of stories. There were compilations of those that came out, and they were circulating around the papers and around, and widely read. Henry James certainly read many of these stories. And so there is this genre that is building this idea of romance, right? And so at the same time that women are entering this new occupation and developing professionalized skills, they're also reading stories in which their ultimate goal is to be a wife. So the ultimate pinnacle of that story is that they get to leave their jobs, and that's the reason that they're there. However, many of these stories involve confusion of identity and gender because of coded communication and because of the fact that the sender isn't known. And so one of the most popular stories of the day was Ella Cheever Thayer's Wired Love. And this comes out in 1880. And so it seems to mimic one of those very familiar stories in the character Natty Rogers. Natty Rogers, however, she gets caught up in this game of trying to be a professional woman, but also entangled in this love interest with a man named Clem over the wire. Now, while she does end up with Mr. Clem after a series of shenanigans and very dramatic scenes, she does help us understand how the conditions women were being asked to work under, in which they were supposed to both be seeking romantic interests and seeking professional lives, wasn't tenable. That there was too much pressure being put on women to carry all of that at once, and there we get the kind of narrative of can we have it all, which we still see today. And so Henry James also writes in 1898, a little bit later, a story in which he has an unnamed protagonist. It's called In the Cage, and she also is caught up in this narrative that comes out in these mediated love stories, in these telegraphic romances. And she believes that she is going to find a better life by meeting some man over the wire. And so she pursues this in a point where she is deluded and nearly tries to break up an aristocratic marriage between this man, Captain Everard, and his illicit lover. And so she fails in this attempt, and she becomes the fool of the story. In effect, James is pointing us to the fact that these mediated love stories let women down, that they don't provide any fulfillment in the end, and that they provide a false sense of identity for women, in which they can have it all, or in which the professionalism can lead to the marriage. So that's an empty narrative. But there's a different side to that story. Rather than just saying, meh, women can't have it all, sorry guys. So there's an author named Lyda Churchill, who I found in archival research. There are about 5 copies of her book in the United States. The book is called My Girls, and she was a very popular writer of telegraph stories at the time, although nobody knows who she is now. And nobody has read this book, save for maybe a handful of people that I have found. And I had to go to Virginia to get to this book and physically read it. But she proposes that telegraph girls in her story, My Girls, are actually women who form strong networks of connection that elevate themselves above class expectations and that can seek professional careers without marriage. And she posits that telegraph work, the connections it creates among women, create stronger professional possibilities and stronger women because of their exposure to rewrite the code, right, to rewrite the story. And she essentially writes this very feminist narrative that attempts to rewrite the story of class, right, of these kind of telegraph girls who are making less money and not as respected in their professions, and then elevating them, and they eventually become famous writers, humanitarians, opera singers, and public readers. And so they become pinnacles of success. So it's a very different narrative. And so we can see how the idea of code switching and reinterpreting code, right, breaking established codes, becomes something that's possible with the new form of communication and networking that becomes possible with the telegraph. And so just in closing, for that pattern recognition, I'll just turn your attention to that last quote on your handout. It's very long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. But if you take the time to read the entire excerpt, you'll see that it is a defiant announcement of the power of telegraph girls and how they can actually be seen as more powerful than at this time of the Gilded Age, which we are entering, right, into the 1880s, of the most powerful aristocrats who at the time, through concepts like social Darwinism, were made to seem like the moral and ethical kind of pinnacle based on their professional success. And so Natalie Ainsley, who is the main character of the novel, is speaking to a woman, rather, who doesn't know her identity, which yet again picks up in the form of the Telegraph, who has said, oh, have you heard of this famous author, Natalie Ainsley? And, you know, I heard she was a poor telegraph girl, and maybe she doesn't even write her own stuff. And she comes back with this big rebuttal, in which she's tried to have been knocked down a few pegs because she was a telegraph girl. Natalie Ainsley, it's true, was once very poor, and not long since was supporting herself and helping to support another. But the money she earned telegraphing, and the pay received occasionally for a sword. But she did not went on every day with the lords, and on those but seldom taken vacations, she was obliged to sit through long and oftentimes tiresome hours in her office, and to plan constantly how to make her every dollar bring its most profitable equivalent to her, or to send it to another who belonged to the lower class. She strove to be honest and true to the best part of herself. She tried to do her duty every day, and gleaned from every possible source the information that helped her, with only such assistance as she obtained from the advice and criticism of some good friends who had been, and one of whom still is now, engaged in the same business by which she had for some years mostly gained a livelihood, to write an intelligent book. The laboring classes are not necessarily poor things, in the sense you mean by the word poor. And so she attempts to rewrite this idea of her status and her professionalism and what the skills she has gained amount to. At the same time, when companies like Western Union were paying women less and were kicking them out of their jobs once they got married. So, these are the patterns that I have noticed, and that the form of the medium inspires different kinds of ideas about gender and work. And my big project is to expand that network and keep expanding that network so we find out more stories, so we can see how, when new media are introduced, how it does provide opportunities for shifts and changes in how we view particularly gender.
Thank you so much, Callie. And now we'll hear from Sal, who will be very critical, I imagine, and condemnatory, as he usually is.
Lance has me all wrong. Basically. Actually, reading through Callie's work, I see it's enormously perceptive and insightful. And I think it's a tribute to the meteorological perspective that we look to literature, really, imaginative literature, to really understand much of what happens when a new medium enters into a society, or that a society is drowning in a particular medium. I just want to ask Callie a few questions Just for my own, and I hope it's perceptive for all of you. I'm under the impression that the Telegraph folks, people who worked in telegraphy, were mostly men. This is, I'm assuming, true.
Not necessarily. It depends on the period. So true, yes. I think overall, I think the majority of workers were men. But that takes into account location too. So city centers and large cities, and also high traffic areas of telegraphy, generally men were employed in those positions. But rural offices were largely filled with women because it was harder to get people to work in those offices, and they were more likely to be free for those jobs. So in certain cases, there were either majority or about an equal amount of women working, particularly in rural offices.
Yeah, because I'm thinking that in the history of telegraphy, men in the beginning take most of the positions, and then as telegraphy becomes part of the environment, the larger environment, the jobs are not considered that groundbreaking, and therefore women can, can gain access. But when you were talking about the author of My Girls and that text, I mean, I can tell why maybe 10 people in the country read it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a critique, and why publishing companies wouldn't push it. It's a critique of sexism and the class system. I mean, this particular section is worthy of, a Marxist perspective.
Absolutely.
So you can see why, right, that number one, the book wouldn't be promoted, but number two, why it would be almost an affront to what was going on in 19th century political philosophy, which was a kind of unfettered capitalism.
Certainly. And I do want to just correct, because I gave you the wrong impression. This was a very popular book at the time. And so it was republished about 4 years after it was originally published in 1882. But since then, it hasn't been reprinted and hasn't been revisited. And she also has these other very kind of brash and in-your-face stories with these very proud heroines who don't get married, who take risks on the wire, and who mess with men, to be honest, and humiliate them sometimes too. And yet, we don't read those stories. We're reading James's story in which the woman is humiliated. And he is considered the pinnacle of achievement in terms of the canonicity of those stories.
Right, so we're talking about another level now.
Yeah.
That this book needs to be part of the canon.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Because if it was really popular, then that would bring another perspective to the discussion.
Yeah, and I think the formulaic nature of lots of Telegraph stories make people kind of think like,
Right.
read one, read them all. And also you can see there's a very big kind of sentimental influence in this. You can see a temperance influence, there's a big temperance influence in the novel as well, which was very common in the late 19th century. So she is picking up on lots of kind of conventional ideas of social shifts and change, but she is doing something remarkably different, I found, compared to other Telegraph stories.
Well, the sentimental novel was the big deal in the 19th century, and the temperance movement was incredibly popular.
Yes.
And especially among women.
Not
But-
among you all. No,
But there's a reason for that. The reason it was popular among women is, first of all, liquor in those days didn't go through the environmental protections that we have today. Let's put it this way: there was no FDA. In other words, when you could take a bottle of red wine that you made, regardless of how poisonous it was, and sell it, and you could call it anything. There were no rules and regulations in that regard. So men doing all the drinking had, besides enormous amount of alcoholism, and the negative effects of that always affected families and women, right? So, yeah, there's a reason why women were part of the temperance movement, that's for sure. Can I switch gears now and talk about Hawthorne?
Sure.
Because I'm thinking part of Callie's, her second chapter is really all about the house. Well, one part of it is about the House in Seven Gables, which, folks, is a novel that needs to be read more and more, I think. It's a 19th century text by Nathaniel Hawthorne, more famous probably for the Scarlet Letter. And but as you were talking about that front page of the newspaper, what was it, the Tribune?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm thinking the House of the Seven Gables is a mosaic in a sense, right? I mean, not just the house itself, but it's a mosaic of all of these characters. Could you speak to why you chose that text and how, and sort of reiterate, you talk a little bit about the daguerreotype, and how that medium is, well, and the insights of Hawthorne about the medium come through in that book.
Sure. So the daguerreotype was a point of fascination for Hawthorne. He would go to Daguerreotype Studios. He would go to the Southworth and Haas studio in Boston, and he would hang around and he would figure out how the process goes. He was very invested in the process and trying to figure that out. Actually, many scholars have contemplated how the book actually attempts to mimic a daguerreotype in its aesthetic and his use of light and dark, particularly in the scene where he takes a daguerreotype of Judge Pynchon, which is the most consequential moment in the novel that changes the trajectory of the lives of all of the characters, in which they realize that Judge Pynchon is now dead. And it doesn't become concrete until the daguerreotype is shown and until people have proof of that. And so I do argue that it is set up in a central place in terms of like the climax of the action to create this kind of falling action in the novel, in which kind of things change course and they move out to the country. It doesn't happen until Phoebe sees that daguerreotype and says, oh, he's dead. And now I'm going to marry you, Holgrave, right? And we're going to go to the country and get out of the city. It's also consequential in changing her work life, as I say. So it is a point of fixation in the novel, and it reflected a point of fixation for Hawthorne himself, trying to figure out, right, also his concept of realism, combining the imaginary and the everyday, romance. His concept of romance, which was the imaginary and the everyday, right, incorporating a bit of both of those together. And he kind of caught up the daguerreotype in that as well, and trying to catch the fascination with it and to kind of think about its aesthetic effects. But I also think that it had gendered effects as well.
You know, what I'm hearing when you're describing that is I'm hearing McLuhan's tetrad, how the medium does this, it does that, it brings this in, it flips. And so one of the things that you might want to say is that Hawthorne can be considered a forebearer of media ecology.
Yes.
But he wasn't, he wasn't the only writer who was interested in media, actually. Mark Twain invested heavily in the typewriter.
Yeah, and
So,
lost
and-
a lot of money.
We lost a fortune and a half. So,
Mark Twain, who was a founding member of the Players Club, by the way.
well, that's why I brought him up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll turn now to Elena Lamberti.
Right, and speaking without the martinis, so bear with me. With the martini would be better, but no, I was listening, Kelly's talking, and with the greatest interest, because I confess I haven't read the whole dissertation she wrote, and definitely I will. No, but I will, because what I heard really resonates with a lot of research I've been doing recently, and there are so many words that resonates, and well, you ended with Harry James, so I pick up from Harry James, and I think it's fascinating for me, for my Italian years, to hear you comparing or using daguerreotype with Harry James, because the criticism we pursue with Harry James is with photography and not with daguerreotype. So I think it's way better to daguerreotype because with the photography.
Speak a little louder.
Sorry. Yes. It's daguerreotype is black and white. It's positive and negative. The photography is not that. It's a framed, so it's something that you have to investigate. Or at the end of the 19th century was more reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but this idea is so good, and especially the fact that you combine the technology with the development of a new form. And I do associate Harry James with the idea of impressionism, which is something he passed on to Ford, Meadows Ford, and Joseph Conrad, right? The way, I quote by heart, so I might be wrong, but I think it's Ford remembering his work with Conrad, and of course in the wake of James' experiments as per The Art of Fiction, 1884, when Ford writes, "We saw that life did not narrate, but made impressions on our brain. We, in turn, if we wish to produce an aspect of life on you, must not narrate, but render impressions." And impression is not framed, is something that can be both positive and negative. So I think this idea of developing the impact of the daguerreotype and the way he uses it to change the main narrative is absolutely fascinating. And another curiosity I have, I think it follows what I just said. The period you chose. The period you chose is quite emblematic. So would you tell us more about the choice of the period? Because, for instance, with mediacology, the moment you mentioned penny press, the daguerreotype, the telegraph, the connection for me is electricity, and so immediately I switch to modernism, so a bit farther than the period you discussed. But I think you're absolutely right, because this is just before the electric age became so clear, or at least more visible.
Yes.
So I love working back from these bigger questions. So I referenced this idea of can women have it all, right? Breaking the glass ceiling, right? Tracing these questions back to they have origin stories, and I am fascinated by tracing them back to the forms of media that brought women into the workforce, and also gave rise to the middle class, which forms so much of our identity, especially from an American context about who we are. And so also this period from 1840 to 1900 really does mark so many successive and influential forms of media that were just never introduced before, including photography, including having the capability of mass communication for the first time, which is where media ecologists really trace the formation of mass communication and thinking about that as a kind of world-changing and world-making event with the press. And also, we have film that's starting to be introduced at the end of the century. We also have other innovations of the cars being developed just at that turn of the century too. But the kind of successive new changes, right, need consistent reevaluation of what work life is, of what home life is, of what gender is. And so I do think that I focused on this period first because there was so much newness, especially with electricity, but also because there is this consistent narrative of trying to deal with, right, what are the terms, what are the uses, what are the forms, and it comes out in the literature of the period, not just in terms of authors worried about their own status, right? Are people going to read books anymore? Are they just going to look at pictures? Do people want to read books anymore? Or they just want to send telegraphs? So So that's a lot of the focus goes there, I think, in literary scholarship, is thinking about the author's mindset. But also, McLuhan said that, especially people, authors like Poe and others who use a medium, an artistic medium, that they are the most attuned to tracing the effects of any particular medium, because they are working with a kind of form of communication that requires mediation, that requires a kind of knowledge about form and not just content alone. And so I think the newness and the successiveness and the ways that it links so well with the 20th century, I think there's like deeper foundations that we can keep searching back for.
Absolutely, and you also mentioned, of course, the detective stories. And speaking of Poe, we have to think of the philosophy of composition,
Yes.
which is precisely on what you just said, right? How to work out the affects, right? So, you know, I know how to create an affect. I know how to, create an illusion, or even to manipulate the mind, which is another 20th century hot issue even today, I guess. But I want to ask you if you can expand a bit more, not on Edgar Allan Poe, which is of course a founding father of ecology himself. If I think of the preface to the Mechanical Bride, of course, it's a descent into the maelstrom that triggered it all. But more about Margaret Fuller, because as an Italian, I am a big fan. She was a big fan of
She went to
Mazzini.
Italy on
She went to
assignment.
Italy, exactly. So
Married
she-
an Italian revolutionary.
Exactly, and she became a revolutionary herself. But not only a revolutionary of the Italian Risorgimento, but a revolutionary of the mind.
Yes.
And in fact, I think you pointed out the idea of the mosaic approach to the women image, right? It speaks towards that.
Yeah, as I said, it's difficult to pick one piece, because it's like you have to read all of women in the 19th century to get the full effect of what we're talking about. So it is hard to analyze and to present. So I apologize for that. However, what I can say is that the way that she integrates her discussion of things like myth along with politics and along with modern day discussions, there is no break in the way that she presents that. They are all fluid in her mind. And so actually, when people were critiquing this work, even Poe said, her mind works in a way that other people's do not. She can't speak for all of women because her mind is so quintessentially her own. And it worked in such a way that he felt other people couldn't understand it, or at least other women couldn't. So he didn't feel that she was an adequate representative of her sex. And often, including Emerson, called her masculine. They labeled her as a man and called her writing spermatic because it didn't fit into a mold of women's intellectual capability. And it's that intellectual capability that Dupin has in the detective tales that nobody else has. And she has that intellectual capacity that other male authors and even women reviewers couldn't place. And so she is demonstrating through the construction of that text, the mosaic layering of that text, how women's capacity for intellectualism and a kind of higher order of thinking could be translated into their effective work outside of the home.
Absolutely. In fact, I tend to associate her work more to Whitman's than to Emerson, right? I see myself and all the variables of myself, male, female, black, white, big, small. I think, but I don't know, I must confess, I don't know Whitman's take on others, so I don't know. But the mental association goes there.
Yeah, I think the idea to connect large and small, to think universal and atomistic, and to really expand the range of the mind. I think you're certainly right in that respect. And of course, they both share in the transcendentalist tradition, although neither of them were kind of professed to be each other's influences or outwardly. And Fuller really did. She was the first female international correspondent for a newspaper. She had one of the first jobs as an editorial writer for the New York Tribune, and she really did take on that professional role in a way that Whitman wasn't interested in the kind of occupational and on-the-ground change that Fuller wanted to see, getting involved in politics and getting involved in things like prison reform and other things like that she was invested in terms of making social change. Whitman was certainly more into popularizing himself as a figure, and crafting a public image of himself to advance his art. And so I think they had different, there was much overlap, but they had different trajectories.
Good point, very good point. And the last thing that it's a bold association, maybe yes, maybe not. But when you talk about the penny press, I jump ahead and I go to a novel which I think was published in 1933, Miss Lonely Heart by Nathaniel West. Yeah, because of course in that case it's a male writer who writes about a female role within the penny press, right? But nonetheless, it is a masquerade that unveils the hypocrisies and the emptiness, the existential crisis of the time, which is one of the consequences of a certain use and abuse of new media of the time as well. I don't know if you've thought about that.
No, I haven't, although it's striking, though, even to see the parallels even today with Fanny Fern. There's a scene in that novel in which, in Ruth Hall by Fanny Fern, in Ruth Hall, in which Ruth goes to meet with her editor and negotiate for a better salary. She's ping-ponging between different editors because she thinks she's worth more, and she has a kind of male advocate that's helping her. And the scene is so emblematic of like a Me Too harassment moment in which she is threatened to no longer have a position or a job, and actually physically and almost sexually threatened as well. There's hints of that in the novel, and about that hypocrisy and creating that kind of climate and culture of the newsroom, and how that is filled with a kind of artifice of like gender dominance. And so it's a breathtaking scene to read today because it just seems so striking with some of the scenes we are hearing about now. And it's interesting that that Fanny Fern takes the opportunity to fictionalize her own life in Ruth Hall and to make that known, to make that kind of intimidation known. And then yet today, women are using the internet and Twitter, which has an anonymity to it, just like it had in the days of the penny press, where Fanny Fern was using a nom de plume and she was not sharing her full identity, where women are feeling empowered to call out injustices in our different kind of entertainment sectors too and beyond. And so I think there are lots of resonances with how women use new media forms and sometimes the anonymity of them too to counter and contest power relationships.
Well, I'd like to just add a little bit that, certainly the point about the Telegraph seems to be a precursor to, I think, what for us is the more, at least for those of us of a certain age, is the more familiar phenomena of the telephone and the telephone operator as being, a very significant area for women in the workplace.
Absolutely. But it's interesting too because the Telegraph, the base of Telegraph workers that eventually became more heavily weighted towards women because it was lower paying, became those telephone operators, which was a lesser skilled job because you didn't have to know code, and you didn't have, so you got paid less money, and it had less professional prestige. So women were actually, from the telegraph industry, kind of trained and driven into these deprofessionalizing or deprofessionalized roles, or more kind of remedial, or I don't know if that's the right word, or more kind of less prestigious and less professional communications positions.
Yeah, and yet we could still trace certain connections, that the telephone system was the precursor to the modern computer. That the first computers were electrical circuits that were plugged in. So, it was exactly that technology. And there were women involved in computing early on that, again, we tended not to be mentioned.
They were information processors.
Yeah, and they,
At the telegraph level.
yeah. And there also were women who were employed as computers, which in the 40s referred to people who did computation, sat down with pencil and paper. So it does seem that there are a lot of other connections that could continue to be made.
For sure. Yeah, I love just creating more parallels and more networks. I just find that really exciting. But from the literary perspective, really trying to draw that there are more voices and more works that we can start to look at, even popular works that I wasn't able to talk to you all about tonight, which we can invest with more meaning and make more connections with. We simply kind of turned our attention to them.
I just also wanted to note that, when Sal brought up the point about Marxism and all of that a lot of this came to a head at the end of the 19th century. And I remember James Carey always referring to the 1890s, that was a very significant decade, along the lines of the 60s in more recent time, as a time of great social upheaval and protest and many movements in various directions. So it does seem that it's all kind of moving in that direction that we're leading up to. So does it mean that, and I think that there's a certain argument that can be made that electronic media are connected to feminism? Would you, does that sound right to you?
Heck yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, Leonard Shlain has this whole argument that the alphabet was connected, was sort of anti-feminist in the sense, you're familiar with Schlain's work, right? That, that it emphasized, what was it, the left brain, emphasized a kind of male-oriented brain, that was where orality was more egalitarian, more feminist, and that was sort of like the natural state. You worked with the idea of the goddess, and then electronics as bringing, as undoing that, and therefore being feminist in orientation. Not everyone, accepts that, but Shlain was kind of following a McLuhanistic point of view in his argument.
But if you even look forward to a theorist like Donna Haraway, who is the manifesto for cyborgs, right, thinking about advances in biomedical engineering and technology and integrating electronics with the body as actually being the gateway to obliterating gender and like a certain form of feminism. So I think, it just depends on whose story you want to listen to.
Actually, we were recently at a conference in Bologna, and they were showing these neuro images of the brain, female and male brain, pretty scary. But they were showing that female brain processes things horizontally. So there is a great dialogue between the two hemispheres. And male are more vertical.
Right.
So, but this was interesting because, of course, I understand and I am, pro Haraway that way. But, when you see that physiological net, it's a fact. So, and then you can speculate about how that is. It's a cultural thing. It's what? It's a physiological, it's cultural. What is the relation between the two? But graphically, it was so clear, horizontal, vertical.
I'm sorry. So it's like I'm so fascinated. I can understand you correctly because like in this age of where everything is so fluid and there's so many questions about what is male, what is female, and is it culture? Are you saying that that was, are you questioning, or are
I'm
you
just,
saying that that's what it was?
I'm just sharing what I saw.
Yeah, no,
following
it's
this, but
fascinating.
that's
So,
very fascinating. So
Really?
one
So
thing
that they're saying that they're really,
Yes,
you
exactly.
know,
How
so
they
male
respond.
is
Yeah.
this,
And you know what?
and female is this.
Exactly.
So
This
there's a
was,
physiological.
and the conference was on storytelling, and so they were processing how people respond to different forms of storytelling. So it was within the literary field, right? And again, it's horizontal and vertical, which is interesting because, of course, it could open up a new way to understand the canon, and also the cultural dimension of how you create a canon, which leaves a few things out and other things in. But it's pretty new. For me, it's a new language. The neuroimaging applied to literature. For me, it's new. But this is something that I just saw that triggered some curiosity.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
of course,
Especially in this very
Yeah.
cultural moment of gender
yeah. So the
discussion.
neural mirror, and how that can help you to visualize what you don't see from the outside, right? But it's happening inside your brain. So it's another dimension that we can start to add. And actually, I have something. Any plan to bring some of these women back to us? Because it seems there is a lot of potential to actually,
Resurrect them.
Yes,
Like-
yes, exactly.
I would love to, in addition
You're
with
gonna have
live
a seance?
Churchill, I would love to get Lida Churchill's work published again, because I do think it's a 19th century text that, while it is conventional in many ways, and it's why I think it's been ignored so much, I do think it offers, especially if you're looking from the perspective of thinking about technology as a kind of locus of how we organize and think about literature. I think it certainly belongs there, especially right up there with James, who gets so much of the literary space.
Yeah.
And you can see that actually James is being pretty derivative in his story. His characters very much mimic the characters in other Telegraph stories,
Sure.
and hers is quite novel for a Telegraph
Makes sense.
story.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a lot more that can be shown comparatively there.
Go ahead.
During World War II, for instance, the decoders over the Brooklyn Navy Yard were mostly women. And in England also. I only know the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
Which probably is, just to formalize it, that we can open this up to questions and comments from the audience, just to say that. And Terry,
What struck me is that we're talking about the Industrial Revolution and the changing roles of men and women, and overriding that, I was thinking of McLuhan, didn't he say, look to the artists to inform you at the cutting edge of society? So I think, literature is art. And so it just fits right in with that. And I love the idea of looking at literature with that lens of, why, and what about the demographics of the authors? What was their social background? Where were they raised? What was their education? What were they thinking about? And how did that overlay their creativity?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to recognize that many of these new and emerging technologies were not available to everybody.
That's
People
the
couldn't
point.
afford daguerreotypes from just any
Right.
average person. Your access to telegraphy might be limited if you weren't spending money on sending telegraphs, and you never learned Morse code, right? It was specialized. And so many of the ways people came to terms with what these new industries were and what these new places of work were. Telegraph offices were some of the first offices women ever worked in. For instance, up through the 1880s, there weren't even public bathrooms for women in regular spaces. So to imagine those new environments, you needed a literary space because that was how it circulated. And so there's a literary scholar named Marcy Dinius who has a book called The Daguerreotype and the Press, and she contends and I build off that work, is that people's first encounters, the majority of which in America with daguerreotyping, were through stories rather than the daguerreotype itself.
Yeah, it would make sense, right? Because the means of communication, I mean, today it would be all over Facebook, right? The news of a daguerreotype, right? It'd be all over Twitter or whatever. But that's how people learned, I would imagine, in those days when it was through stories. I wanted to go back to one of the things you said about Margaret Fuller, who was seen as kind of masculine. Part of that critique was the men who were making that critique. They were educated in rhetoric, and they, in rhetoric you have the masculine rhetoric and you have feminine rhetoric. And feminine rhetoric didn't mean that it was by women; it meant that it was more storytelling. And Fuller's work, if I'm not mistaken, was more expository. And so she would be criticized, not criticized is not the right word, she would be explained as a kind of masculine. I don't think it was much of a, I don't think it was a put down in that regard. Or am I wrong about that?
Well, I don't know. I think you're certainly right that there were different ideas about what different kinds of expression were categorized as. So that certainly could play a factor, but Emerson in particular just thought that she should have been a man. Just kind of said, she has that spirit, that's who she is.
Well, what a stereotype.
Yeah, and I mean, physically in appearance, she wasn't known to be beautiful, so there were lots of different contributing factors there. She also didn't want to get married, but kind of got married through pressure because she got pregnant, and there was a lot of ways in which she defied lots of feminine conventions. So I think there are a lot of different ways to look at that. But that's certainly a factor that can't be weighed out. You're right.
Just maybe to go a little further on that, I mean, Walter Ong writes about this, that men would go to schools where women tended to learn how to read and write at home, and the traditional schooling, and I think that's more, especially on the Catholic side, but I think just generally was rooted in rhetoric and oratory, which involved learning to read and write along with public speaking. And I mean, he referred to this as agonistic because it involved debating and argument, that was the rhetorical concept, so that men's writing brought with it, had a more traditional connection to older forms of oratory. And what Ong says is that when women became novelists, they were more fully and completely literate, not having that residual orality that they were bringing along. So that Jane Austen, for example, defines the novel in many ways, and boy, they sure love making movies from her stuff. But that is more fully literate, more deeply literate than some of the other forms. Does that ring true, or?
I mean, yes, but Ong also writes in Fighting for Life about how, this context of masculinity, and he is also very kind of in this determined space of that our kind of progression as society is marked by masculine context and ideas like that. But I do think that there are ways in which it's hard to trace, because a lot of these women, for instance, Fuller was very classically educated, and she wasn't educated in the home, and she went out and had, advanced tutors and male teachers.
Which is unusual.
Yes, it was unusual. As a point of comparison, Lida Churchill, she had a poor family, probably, she taught herself Morse code, she just became an author just like her protagonist does, kind of out of hard work and grit, right, and spit and, whatever. And so there are many different influences at work, so it's hard to say if there's kind of one educational background that's really at play here in terms of how these women are approaching storytelling. I think that's hard to generalize because just in a few examples, like these women are not necessarily coming from the same educational space.
Women weren't typically educated. Only particular, upper crust people had allowed their ladies to be educated slightly. And I have an example that comes to mind. Benjamin Franklin was very close to his sister, and in his biography he never mentioned her. His autobiography, even though he wrote her letters, sent her money, and you know how it was then. The women learned at home, the boys went to school, and so the women weren't educated in the same way. So this An's idea about male thinking, women didn't have a voice, and so it had to come through the male, shall I call them, stereotypes, the way that men thought about women and the way that men thought about society, and that we're really looking at a sliver of people here, and the whole population started to work when the Industrial Revolution required more bodies to go to factories and do the job. So we have a lot of different layers going on with it. And it's fascinating to think, I just keep going back to McLuhan, that the cutting edge would be coming from literature. Because we're pointing out patterns that the artists put forth at a time, and we're looking at connections between the 21st century and the 19th century. And they were the ones that brought out the point, so it's just fascinating. And I compliment you on the work.
You know, by the way, that's why they say the Western is so popular, because that's like the farthest back where we can still relate to the people. You know, that's sort of like the beginning, but
Yes.
before that, you know, they're just weird. But, yeah.
Do you have AI views about current media, those come out of the thing, like how is the current media helping women with their identities?
Yeah, as we touched on briefly, thinking about, just the moment that we're in with Me Too and also gender fluidity and thinking about trans identity and how that's really coming to the fore, I really do think that the anonymity of the internet, the interplay of identity that you can have with different social media platforms, the just amount of expression that we have about the varieties of identity that there are, right? So it also is about a kind of combined sense that you can be anonymous, but also that you can have so many different forms of presence. And so that can create a kind of fluidity of identity, which I think we're exploring more as a culture. So I do think that the kind of successive introduction of platforms where you can host identity and post identity and exchange identity, it's no surprise to me then that we are having these discussions about what identity is. So yet again, refreshing that idea about, does gender even exist, right? Or what spectrum is it? Or, how are we thinking and rethinking gender and sex?
But remind me, what was the word that you used to describe the
Mosaic.
mosaic? Because I was thinking that in today's world it's prismatic. So there is a relationship between prismatic thinking and mosaic thinking. Very fascinating.
Well, one thing that occurs to me is our last New York Society meeting, we had poetry.
Yeah.
So, and so someone like Emily Dickinson, I wonder, especially because I've been seeing, I saw these promos for, was it Apple TV is doing, have you looked at poets in this regard? Because we know that when we get to the 20th century, at least from McLuhan, especially, he points out like T.S. Eliot writing about, making reference to. So what about in your time? In your time?
21st century time.
So no, that's a great question, and I do, poetry is part of that mosaic and of what was emerging, and so I actually just was studying Dickinson with my my 10th graders at school. And so we are thinking about that interplay of identity and persona with Dickinson. There's been a lot of research about what she was interested in terms of technology. There's a lot of writing about her in the railroad, and her interest in the railroad coming through her town, that picks up on certain elements of her poetry. I think also the idea of spirituality in technology gets intermingled too with electricity and spirituality. That idea of communicating on another plane, I think, was something that also shows up in her work too. The kind of ideas about like ephemeral connection and like intangible connection. So those come through as well. But I think I'm not as much as an expert in terms of what work has been done with her and specific medium because she of course self-published her own poems and wrote them and binded them and thought about how to package and create them without publishing them, of course.
Did Whitman too, or what?
So Whitman published and republished and paid for his own publishing. So Dickinson actually just sewed her poems together in a book and wrote and rewrote on scraps of paper and crossed out things. And so she was almost forming her own kind of medium, right, where it was combining handwriting with the idea of a printed book. And of course was never circulated except for a handful of poems. So it's hard to say exactly what her interaction with different forms of media would have been. So I think that's a fascinating thing to...
Yeah, the same thing happened really with Whitman. Whitman published one book, The Leaves of Grass, and then he rewrote it 7 or 8 times, and added stuff, took out stuff. It was one long, poem, really. And with Dickinson, if I write, only certain things came out, and with Whitman. But one of the things that Whitman was into was photography. He was interested in his own image. He was, I think, the 2nd or 3rd most photographed man in the 19th century. Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln were just ahead of him. He was very self-promotional as an author. Something, unfortunately, Dickens was not.
No,
With
not.
Emily Dickinson, I mean, she was so ahead of her time, and was not encouraged, did not feel she had a voice. Her father was very adamant, not wanting to publish as well, who was a founder of a prominent citizen of Amherst, and her grandfather was founder of Amherst College, so he really, he bought her books but urged her not to read them. And that just kind of, if you ever see a picture of him, he's very stern. And he did not promote her to publish because saying, a woman at this era, you're not going to be socially accepted, when you do merit material published. So it's very questionable. I feel that she was so ahead of her time, she knew she would not be understood. So she just did not have a voice. And she was from a family, very dominant male. Her brother was the crazy stones of her father, who was going to carry the family name. She was just a mere daughter who was known for her family.
I agree with you. In fact, I think that she would have loved perhaps to have poetry published, but she was absolutely prevented from. She tried actually. She had a couple, not many, just she had a few poems published, but and what you were saying that she was in fact preparing for, I think she was hoping for the next step, but it never happened for the circumstances that you described. So I agree with you.
And they found a trunk, not even her family knew of our poetry. It was a trunk load of those 40 fascicles. She sewed all these 40 fascicles, these poems together, and they were unknown even to her family, even to her sister, she was very close to. They were hidden in their trunk. So we don't know what her end, she's very mysterious. The woman has been beaten so we don't know what her intentions were. but I feel that she was just so ahead of her time. She knew it was not going to be understood. They changed her poetry all around too when they did publish it after her death, and not until 1955 did they come out with her poetry the way it was written. She passed in 1886.
There was Rodin had a student who exceeded him, and yet nobody knows about her because she was a woman. And there was the same thing with Azula. There was a woman who was proficient as Tiffany was, who did everything. She did every single piece of her jewelry was done by him. All of her jewelry is now in museums because nobody would buy them. They, as exquisite as they were. And I really do feel when I was there fascinated by the Virgil and the Dante, because there have been many men who've been thought to be very feminine and being nurturing, and so many women who've been thought to be masculine simply because they were intelligent and thought out of the box. And it's perception.
Well, Leonard Schlain's last book, which was published posthumously, is about Leonardo da Vinci, with that argument that he had a feminine brain, and that that's associated with left-handedness, and also with perhaps being gay or bisexual, or heard rumors about that. I did want to note that Emma Lazarus did get some notice in her time, and pretty significant publication when you think of that plaque on the Statue of Liberty. But I'm not sure that they, actually you could see like the reference or the influence of, like, say, the Telegraph or photography, informing their work, and that was really what I was particularly interested in.
But Emma Lazarus came from a more upper-crust family and interacted in the social world of that day. And so it was the upper-crust people, so
But
that
she
was
did write.
wonderful.
She did write to Whitman and was looking for his encouragement, which he was not. He didn't. It's like,
Well, because it's just a woman.
yeah.
But, the women had their place in the home, and that's how it was.
Yeah. Well, Brian has.
First of all, I really enjoyed your presentation. I really loved to read your dissertation. I really enjoyed the responses from the respondents. It was really good, very engaging and very well connected. I'm going to ask a slightly speculative question, which goes back to one of the first books I read as a young was Frankenstein. And it was that my grandmother on my father's side was a poet and had her literary magazine in the 1920s in her college, and that my aunt, one of her daughters, was working for the telephone company. And it made me think, while you were all talking, that you were in certain ways thinking, like, it's not the women that are oppressed, that women are below the surface, that it's not that women are not the coders, maybe women are the code.
Try to sort it out.
Yeah, I think part of the work is to say that we have operated thinking that there has been one code, right? That there has been a kind of narrative that we already know, which is that the men dominate and are in power and are the professionals, and the women are the objects, and they are subservient, and they are pushed aside. And so there is another code. There are different codes. There are different ways of using the formal elements of the medium to reinterpret that code. And so I think it is part about the stories we tell ourselves and the stories that we listen to. Because, for instance, for now, like many of the narratives, we don't even just about women in tech, right? Women in technology, right? There's not enough women. They don't go into those fields. They don't have the high positions. And when they do, they have to lean in by Sheryl Sandberg and be more masculine, right? So, and then when they do get into those jobs, they're harassed, right? So those are the stories and those are the narratives. And I'm not saying those aren't true stories. I'm not saying that's not part of our code. but I do think that we get locked into one view of that story over and over again, right? It's the old story in a new way. But there are different networks of stories, and I think that might change the way we think about what position women really are in or could be in.
Pun intended, but in that regard, it seems like there's a binary code.
Well,
Right.
I don't know if it's binary. I would like to say that it expands, right? That there are more than two options,
Let's
that
say
there are
it's
more
changing.
than, that there is more, right? Yeah, that it is multi-layered and there are many different avenues.
We need to think general semantics, not either or, but and.
Right.
And that can,
Well, but remember that we use binary code and we can encode lots of possibilities
Right,
in
yes.
binary.
That's true.
Did we have a question back there? Were you-
No.
No, okay.
I wanted to say that I went to an all-girls school, and it was 50 years ago, it was a long time ago. But I thought society was putting people in boxes. That's what they did. I remember saying, we were raised, it was a very private school, finishing school, and they raised us to be the perfect wife, perfect corporate executive. And all I kept saying is, why can't I be the corporate executive? Why can't I be the person? I did found my own business by the time I was 23. But that's the way I thought. And they didn't like it. And they thought there was something wrong with it. And I used to argue with them all the time. And I was a Catholic at one time. And it was like, you were supposed to follow this particular path. And some women, I'm one of them, said, I don't want to follow that path. I want to do what I want to do. But most people did not because they were afraid. And I think that to a great extent in the last 20 years, and certainly in the last decade, and it needs to go even further. Because I don't think there should be a role, but there is. I mean, but society determined that, not the individual.
well, culture, school.
You know, it's funny that we're kind of also seeing this play out now in the motion picture, right?
Oh,
You know,
yes,
that
yes.
that whole interest in women making movies, you know, that in the long history of Hollywood,
Right.
was that women movie stars were often the biggest movie stars, you know, back in the days of classic Hollywood. But women behind the cameras, this is, like a fairly recent thing. Huh?
I'm just thinking about, I'm sorry, I'm talking about looking at Reese Witherspoon,
Right.
Yeah.
all these women,
Getting
it's
Yeah.
not just about the fact that women were movie stars, it's like what roles were they playing? What were they, and so now these strong, powerful women roles are now, and I was like.
But there's also the women directors. I mean,
Yeah,
that is the
that's
big
right.
push.
Yeah, directors and producers.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, I don't know if this has to do with anything after 3 glasses of wine, so I apologize. But I was just like, I was watching The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
Oh, I love it.
Right? And I was just like, it's interesting because it's moving now into the 60s, and now you have this, this woman, the wife, the mother, who's now rebelling. And and she's been raised all of these years to be subservient. And now even in primetime media, it's very interesting to see exactly what you're saying.
One of the really interesting things that I found in my archival research is I was desperately trying to find a story about a woman daguerreotypist. Right? Trying to find a story. I had searched the UR archive, all of the archives I could find about daguerreotype stories, and I can't find a single one except for one based in France, where women are daguerreotypists. And it was much more popular in France earlier on, and was much more widespread and used artistically before really commercially. And in the United States, it was used more commercially before it was used artistically. And so I could not find an American narrative of a woman daguerreotypist from the period that I was studying. And so I had to go to archives and figure out what were these women doing. So I went to the South Berlin Hawes archive, up in Rochester, New York, at the Eastman Museum, And so you can find the ledgers where women were being paid to color daguerreotypes and to produce daguerreotypes. They were working in the studios and shops. They were often sought after to work in them to help work with clients and work with women and work with children. And even there were women daguerreotypists, which I found were getting paid and were actually, lending equipment and buying equipment from these different daguerreotype studios, but you really can't find any written record of the work that they're doing. How many daguerreotypes were they coloring? What were they paid for what kinds of work? The records just aren't there. And so Peter Palmquist has done a lot of work for photographers of the West in finding women photographers, and he has a wonderful 2-volume work of compiling all of this information that he found, which is incredible. But overall, in a literary space, they are almost completely evacuated, which is why I think the sub-story in Ruth Hall is so interesting. Even though Mrs. Skiddy is not a daguerreotypist, she understands that the daguerreotype holds a certain kind of power, or at least tries to wield it herself.
Bob, you had a question?
I was just thinking that in this dichotomy between man and woman, where does the dichotomy of class come into this?
Yeah.
I always think
And
it's
race.
absent
Race,
from
too.
American dialogue.
Yeah.
But before we get to race, let's just talk about class.
Yeah, I mean, class is certainly a huge concern in Churchill, and about women being deemed part of the lower class because of the kinds of work that they're doing. And so major part of her critique is class. In most of these stories that I study, these are middle class, I would say, up to aristocratic women that are featured in these stories, except for the Telegraph stories, which they are typically kind of a working class nature, which we would call more like blue collar than white collar. And so I think the entrance into kind of a Marxist debate or into kind of social Darwinism really comes more with the and more focused discussion of class really comes with the Telegraph stories as those debates are happening in the 19th century about class and about the Gilded Age and about morality and worth as being connected to class. And we can see that Churchill's trying to unbalance kind of what was happening at the time, which is that if you are of a higher class, you have a higher moral worth. In terms of looking the furthest back, in terms of looking at like Dupin, he's kind of like a misfit in prose writing, and he elopes with like his roommate, friend, buddy / maybe lover in like this weird decrepit house, and he kind of doesn't have a class. He's out of money, but he gets money by becoming a detective, and he's able to earn his own keep. And so it is an entrance into a kind of financial stability, being able to use the skills of the press. And certainly Fuller also sought that for women. She wanted them to be able to attain class status. And she often likens women to slaves, which is problematic in many respects, in their current state of not having access to any kind of equality. But that's a class critique, right? That women are outside of the class system before they can be able to be seen as professionals and as women with intellectual worth. And so it is about entering a class system and being involved in that kind of hierarchy. It certainly is a part of all of this.
I think we'll, Terry? Yeah.
I wonder if you ever thought about the role of the grandmothers in indigenous cultures and their role as the original telegraphers. It goes back hundreds of years as organic storytellers and keepers of the wisdom.
So in terms of some of the initial impressions of women's role in the telegraph industry, so they were both thought to, like, in almost a spiritual way, right? Just being able to be good communicators, right? To be able to be a medium. So there's this kind of leftover cultural thinking, I think, about that.
Well, it goes beyond that. They have a major role within the culture.
Yes, but also the other hand of that with telegraphy was that they weren't communicating their own information, that they were transmitting rather than communicating. And so,
Well, there's a very subtle difference there.
certainly, and so I think that is something that maybe is worth exploring in terms of thinking about how, when it becomes corporatized, right, when transmitting and being the kind of vessel for messages, right, when that becomes part of an industry, right, and how that maybe takes, when it has assigned a value, right, when it's assigned a kind of monetary value, what that takes away maybe from the idea of that maybe like larger role that you're thinking about.
I know, but Kelly, that doesn't take away from the fact that they were the grandmothers and the elders, the most respected. And so it's something, to keep in mind. And also their whole relationship with the sort of objective reality of the daguerreotype was a very cautious one. And one has to think about, when you talk about the daguerreotype, it's not just something that's over there. There's always someone, some artist behind it, not just the people that were coloring it. And I have written a great deal about this, but people actually have created them. And their view was, and their image being taken was in fact their soul being taken. So, but I think it's worth actually considering these grandmothers for hundreds of years. That puts our own culture in perspective.
Yeah.
And their role as our teachers, as those who inform us, as those who direct us, as those who give us wisdom and give us hope, inspire us, lift us. So it's just another level.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, a lot of the Telegraph stories, these women, young women who are working, they're usually separated from their families and extended families, either through death because of financial loss. So there is a kind of loss of that longer history and longer connection and tradition.
True, but the elders are always there.
I think, what Terry's getting at is, really goes back to that orality literacy
Correct.
distinction.
Yeah.
So in an oral culture, elders are valued because they have the memory, they hold the experience. And that gets kind of short-circuited in literary culture, literate culture, because you can go get it from the book, so that
Right.
elders are no longer valued, and that the more that women become immersed in that literate culture, the less value grandmothers have in their eyes.
Completely.
I just want to know, what's interesting about the Telegraph then is really kind of getting at a kind of different thing, is that spiritualism as a movement starts up after the Telegraph, and it is this idea, and it's kind of divorced from the more traditional religious notion of heaven and hell. It's just that there are spirits that exist there's life after death. There's a spirit world that can be contacted in the same way that you have otherworldly messages through the telegraph lines. And it made me think that when you think about seances, the medium is often, in many cases, is the woman rather than a man who does the seance. And whether that's a connection that could also be interesting.
Yeah, so women's telegraphers were definitely tied to the occult in many, especially Victorian.
And I think you can think of Alice Bailey and the Theosophist Society. She was one of the originators, founders of the Theosophism. Phenomenal woman of wisdom and spirit who gave a lot to the world.
Could I say one last thing?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the period that you wrote that you studied, 1848. At that time, in the census records, they didn't even list wrote male occupation. And so there, that was just the way it was. Women were in the home, and that was the time, 1850, things started to change a little bit. But people lived in homes. If somebody was a bachelor or a single person, they lived in a family in a boarding house with other people. It was the start of change. But this genre and this period of time was more traditional than not. And so it would
But
bring
part-
in that
Part of what women, part of that is misleading, because what they were doing in the home
was
were
necessary.
they were doing an enormous amount of work. A home in the 19th century, the early 19th
It was
century,
a center of power.
yeah, it was
You couldn't
akin
eat
to
or
a
have
factory.
clothes if you didn't have women.
Right, it was akin to a factory. They would make butter, they would do that.
Yeah, they did
would do all
everything.
the, yeah.
I'm not saying that wasn't work, I'm saying there was no record of it.
Oh, okay.
I think, before I make a final wrap up, I mean, you have last comment, Elena? Did Sal?
I think it's a remarkable study.
Yeah. Callie, would you, any?
No, I'm happy to share it, and it continues to fuel my thinking and my teaching, and thank you all for your comments and your thoughts. It's just, I love just seeing where it goes, so if you're part of that, thank you.
I think it is worthy of being published as a book, and I hope that you do that. I'd like to thank Elena Lamberti for coming here special, all the way from Italy, just to be with us tonight. And thank Sal Falica for coming all the way from Brooklyn, just to be with us tonight. And thank Dr. Callie Gallo for spending time with us. And I'd like to just note that, as I said, this is our last meeting of 2019. Our first session of 2020 will take place on a Friday on January 24th, and we're going to have several out-of-towners joining us for a discussion of the state of the semantic environment. So you'll get a notice about there. Be there or be square. Thank you. Good night.